So the people are forewarned, very much like the story in the Bible, but instead of the God of monotheism, the God of the Bible, we have a confusion of gods with different motives, we will see as the poem progresses, and different reasons. And in a sense, it's more like a Greek idea. They don't really have a reason. Fate ordains that this is supposed to happen. And what's lovely about this poem is that there are interjections, because remember, we're hearing a story that Utnapishtim, the Babylonian Noah, is telling to Gilgamesh, and he is telling us that story. So it's this very complex layering. This is the way the gods think, he laughed. His tone of savage irony frightened Gilgamesh, yet gave him pleasure being his friend. And now we have Utnapishtim's voice. He's been told to warn the people of the flood. But who am I to talk? He sighed as if disgusted with himself. I did as he commanded me to do. I spoke to them, and some came out to help me build the ship of 7 stories, each with 9 chambers. The boat was cube in shape and sound. It held the food and wine and precious minerals and seed of living animals we put in it. My family then moved inside, and all who wanted to be with us there. And then he enumerates who came with him. Remember back to the story in the Bible where species are brought onto the boats. 2 of every animal, 7 of certain animals. The game of the field, the goats of the steppe, the craftsmen of the city came. A navigator came. Well, this is very smart, right? If you're going to have a boat and you're going to have a flood, bring a navigator. Here again, I'd like to remind you of the practicality of those people. They're telling a fabulous story, but they remember to bring the pilot, right? And then Ea ordered me to close the door. The time of the great rains had come. Oh, there was ample warning, yes, my friend, but it was terrifying still. Buildings blown by the winds for miles like desert brush. People clung to the branches of trees until roots gave away. New possessions, now debris, floated on the water with their special sterile vacancy. The riverbanks failed to hold the water back. Even the gods cowered like dogs at what they had done. Well, this is not a notion very biblical, is it? The gods caused something. Now they're not so sure about what they did. They're frightened at their own power that they've unleashed. So it's such an interesting document. It's at the same time more fantastic than the biblical story, but in a sense it's more intimate, it's more human. Oops, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. There's going to be an atomic bomb. There's a flood. Now one of the gods, the goddess, speaks. Ishtar cried out like a woman at the height of labor. Oh, how could I have wanted to do this to my people? And now there's another one of these interesting parenthetical notes. They were hers, notice. Even her sorrow was possessive. Her spawn that she had killed too soon. Old gods are terrible to look at when they weep, all bloated like spoiled fish. One wonders if they ever understood that they have caused their own grief. Okay, we move away from the interjection and back to the narrative. When the 7th day came, the flood subsided from its slaughter like hair drawn slowly back from a tormented face. I looked at the earth, and all was silence. Bodies lay like alewives, dead and in the clay. I fell down on the ship's deck and wept. Why? Why did they have to die? I could not understand. I asked unanswerable questions a child asks when a parent dies, for nothing. Only slowly did I make myself believe or hope they might all be swept up in their fragments together and made whole again by some compassionate hand. I read you the beginning of the 11th tablet, a very powerful piece of writing. I remind you, this is redacted, edited, shaped by 1300 BC. So this is now 3,300 years old. This is a very artful translation in an American literary idiom. And I've chosen a number of translations to work from in conveying these myths, and especially with the Epic of Gilgamesh, because no one translation really can capture all the nuances of the original. Now, imagine something close to this translation being read in 1872 in London to a society of assembled Christian clergymen, academicians, and royalty. The nobility was also assembled. Smith called this the Babylonian Noah, but he did not present it as a refutation of the Bible. He didn't stand up there and say, look, this tells us X about the Bible. He presented it as science, as literature, in the tradition of British exploration and discovery, the Royal Society tradition. But it was taken as a challenge by many people, both by polemicists who wanted to challenge the Bible, and in response by people who wanted to, quote, defend its historicity. So the flood accounts figure largely in our story of challenge and response in the 19th century. And, I should say, in the 20th and 21st century. This conversation is still going on, the conversation about the Bible in the ancient Near East. But its true efflorescence was in the 19th century. Now, another aspect of ancient Near Eastern mythology that challenged the biblically oriented believers was creation account. The Bible opens with a creation account. The Mesopotamians had numerous creation accounts. In their various successive civilizations, they accounted for the creation of the world and humanity, but not in an opening way, not in a way that was fundamental. Rather, we learn about their ideas from other texts. And in a later lecture on creation accounts, I'll be looking at those texts more closely. As in Genesis, their accounts speak of separation, separation of heaven and earth, separation of the waters below from the waters above, separation of the sweet water, that is the water of springs and rivers, from the salt water of the ocean. So the notion of creation is keeping things apart. We also find this in Egyptian accounts. And in Egyptian and Mesopotamian accounts, we find something similar to the biblical idea of creation through speech. It's very articulate in the opening of the Bible. God said, and it came into being. Each of the days of creation ends this way. Well, I should say it begins that way and ends that way. In the end, we're told, and it was good. The creation was good. In Egypt, we have the idea that the god Ptah, in charge of language, had a hand to play in creation. But this is mixed with other Egyptian ideas. There's a wonderful Egyptian notion that humans are created out of clay, which we also find in the Bible. But in the Bible, they're shaped by God. In one ancient Egyptian myth, a lump of clay is put at the potter's wheel, and the god shapes the human on the potter's wheel. So we are shaped literally the way pots are made. Well, here's another challenge. The Bible doesn't offer the only creation account. Here are other creation accounts. Like the flood account, this seems to question biblical originality. A third challenge from the texts, tales of heroes. The more that ancient Near Eastern mythology was translated and published, the more people could see that the heroes of the ancient Near East, Gilgamesh, Sargon of Akkad, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, all had stories which showed common threads with stories in the Bible. I will focus for a moment on the story of Sargon of Akkad, the great unifier of ancient Iraq. We could think of him as the first Akkadian king. Now, his story, like the story of Gilgamesh, kept reverberating through the centuries. And what we read of him reminded many people of the story of Moses in Exodus. I'll read you a fragment from a poem about Sargon of Akkad. My mother conceived me, in secret she bore me. She put me in a basket made of rushes. With bitumen she sealed my lid. She cast me into the river, which rose not over me. The river bore me up and carried me to Aki, the drawer of water. Aki, the drawer of water, took me as his son and reared me. He appointed me as his gardener. When I was a gardener, Ishtar granted me her love. Ishtar, again, the goddess of war and love. And for years I exercised kingship. So he arises to greatness from obscurity. And notice the remarkable similarities to the Moses story. His mother bearing him and hiding him, putting him in a basket, floating him down the river. He's brought up by people other than the people in his family. Finally, he is revealed and he rises to kingship, to leadership. Well, when people read this, they were very startled and they needed a way to respond. So let us look at some of the ways they responded to these challenges, the challenges of the ancient Near Eastern texts. One way, a way that's not really any longer with us but needs to be noted, is complete denial. Well, this is always one possibility with a challenge. I've read many of these responses. It was simply to deny the antiquity and authenticity of the archaeological finds, to say they were hoaxes. That was very common. Of course, there were hoaxes, many, but there were also many real finds. One tract I read, one 19th century tract, said that the devil had planted these finds and texts. That is, there was something demonic about this material because its purpose was to challenge your sense of belief. So denial, now denial as a strategy was not very successful, and as archaeology grew more sophisticated and there was real scientific proof, people could no longer deny this material. A more nuanced, subtle response emerged. And what this did, and this is very much with us, it privileged the biblical text. It said there was something unique about the biblical text, but it didn't dismiss the archaeological record. Rather, it sought in the archaeological record proof that the essence of the biblical picture was correct. Not every detail had to be correct, but the general picture that you get from the Bible's accounts are correct. There was a Jericho, and it was destroyed. Was it destroyed by a procession of trumpeters blowing their horns and causing the walls to fall? Perhaps not. Only someone who asserts biblical inerrancy might say that. But someone who wants to believe biblical historicity and yet believe the archaeological record could say that. Still somewhat problematic because the ruins of Jericho, however the walls fell, don't fit into the chronology of the Bible. Still problematic, but it can be assimilated somehow. So I'm calling this the more nuanced response. There were philosophical responses. Yes, there were affinities between the Bible and the ancient Near East, but these are structural, not in deep content. The claim here was that the Bible had a sort of ethical superiority. These texts were the products of pagan culture. The Bible, the product of a monotheistic culture, was the privileged one. Now, this argument about the historicity of the Bible and the challenge of texts came into discourse in the 19th century and is still with us today, and I will be referring to it many times during subsequent lectures. We've examined in our lecture 4 challenges to biblical authority: geology, evolution, biblical criticism, and ancient Near Eastern texts. We have focused on those texts, the texts in which our myths are recorded, and I surveyed briefly some of the responses to these challenges to biblical authority and originality. In our next lecture, we will move to descriptions of the gods that are depicted in the ancient Near Eastern myths. I will be surveying the pantheons of Egypt and of Mesopotamia.